that God chose to enter into a particular place in human history, I was like, wow. Actually, it's quite emblematic of the human experience to come into a world that is filled with economic trouble and exploitation and militarism and violence and abuse. Like, oh, but that is actually probably more the human experience. Like, it actually epitomizes what it is to be human, is the experience of being at the bottom under the boot of an authoritarian or a regime, of being the outsider because of your skin color, your accent, your station in life, your family. Like, oh, he took on what is probably the most universal kind of human experience.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. You know, when you think about the Christmas story, the birth of Jesus, the angels, the shepherds, the wise men, it's easy to get caught up in the sentimentality of it all. The cozy nativity scene, the baby in the manger, the promise of peace on earth. But what if I told you that the real story of Jesus' birth is much grittier, much more rooted in the harsh realities of human suffering and oppression? That is the perspective that Kelley Nikondeha brings to the table. Kelley is the author of a book called The First Advent in Palestine. And as the title suggests, she's looking at the Advent narrative through a very different lens, one shaped by her own experiences and the people she's met along the way. You see, Kelley is married to someone from Burundi, which has its own long history of colonization and trauma. And when she looks at the story of Jesus' birth, she doesn't just see the tender moments. She sees the generational pain and political upheaval that formed the backdrop for that pivotal event. It's a powerful reframing of a story we think we know so well. Because the truth is, the world Jesus was born into was a world of oppression, a world where the powerful trampled on the weak. And Kelley helps us understand how that context shaped the very nature of Jesus' mission and ministry. This is a conversation that's going to challenge the way you think about Advent and the Christmas story. It's going to ask you to look beyond the sentimental trappings and really grapple with the gritty realities of human suffering. But in doing so, it just might open your eyes to a deeper, richer understanding of the hope that Jesus brought into the world. So join us as we enter Advent today. Here is my conversation with Kelley Nikondeha. Well, Kelley, welcome to Shifting Culture. So excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm glad to be with you.
I'd love to hear some of your story and how being married to someone from Burundi, living half of your time in Burundi, adopting Burundi children, how has that reshaped your thinking about scripture with God and how God interacts in the world?
That was not a question I expected to be right at the top of our Advent conversation, but actually it's a really good one. Marrying Claude, so Claude and I have been married for coming up on 23 years now. And, you know, he comes from Burundi, which is this little country in East Africa that's always at the bottom of the UN developed, the underdeveloped countries. They are always usually in the bottom 5 since I've known him. And of course, I come from one of the larger countries, strong passport, stronger economy, etc. And how much that has shaped the way in which we each see the world, and see life and family has been so formative and determinative. And I think being married to somebody from such a different part of the world, I think the biggest thing that it has done for me is helped me to unpack American exceptionalism, and our kind of that supremacy, whether it's white supremacy, Christian supremacy, that we kind of carry with us coming from an American culture anyways, or a Western culture even. um, you know, to see somebody from another part of the world that we would think of as being less than, and how deeply he loves his country and his highest hopes for his country and his people. And I think watching him interact with my parents, actually, who are very much into the American dream and see the world very differently. I was raised as a evangelical in Southern California, and um, I remember once my mother across the dinner table saying, "Every time you land in America, because you have been allowed to become a naturalized citizen, you should kiss the ground and be so grateful." And she was trying to express her sense of she found it so audacious that Claude still had this deep several years into our marriage, still had this deep love for his home country. And while he loved and appreciated being connected to America, he didn't don the exceptionalism in the way that she thought was appropriate. And I remember it being such a clarifying moment because I also recognized how differently I had become because it had been so gradual for me in the process of our friend marriage that I started to question and understand my country differently and his country and the ways in which we're connected to our homelands. I mean, now homeland is riddled with its own problems, and I still love it because it's home, and I get it in a different way. So I think that was a huge thing for us is or for me anyways, is that I feel like I understand people from other places and how they have to tap dance around us, notions of supremacy and ways in which that impacts their economies and their culture and their own struggle for human rights, etcetera. Um, and I hope it's given me some humility or at least a better sense of my social location and how to carry that in the world.
Yes. Yes. And I think that can actually lead us into this Advent conversation, because that it really helps us view Advent and view the story of the incarnation of Jesus in a way that situates us. Not now for me as an American, I am now a part of the empire, which is different than the people that Jesus actually came for and with. Even though he did come for all of us, that is very true. But he came in a people that was pressed down and subjugated at that time.
Yes.
And then this book that you wrote, the first Advent in Palestine, came out 2 years ago. But I think this has an even deeper resonance with everything that is happening in Gaza and the West Bank.
Mm.
And in that area, there's so many people who can't even get to these areas where Jesus was born. And, there's so much destruction that is happening. And just framing Advent for the listeners, what we're going to be doing this year, we're going to be starting Advent with you talking about this in Advent. And then right before Christmas, we'll have Munther Isaac on, who is the academic dean of Bethlehem Bible College. And so he's going to be talking about what does it really look like on the ground,
Mhm.
especially as a Palestinian Christian perspective and for Palestinians. And so this is going to be, I think, a great framing of how
Mhm.
we can enter into Advent and the hope of Jesus in the midst of what is destruction. And there's a deep sadness and lament of the subjugation of people and destruction and of people that is just devastating and horrible. Saying all of that, I love to get into the story of Advent because we need to know what were the times that Jesus came into. What was happening before? I think we don't really talk about the Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt and everything that was happening. So what was happening with the Jewish people during the time that Jesus came to earth?
I was raised to believe that there was this quiet period, this kind of theological trope of the silent years between the end of what we had called the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible with Malachi, and then the beginning of the New Testament with the Gospels. And I was shocked in my own exploration when I realized it was not so quiet. It was riven with anguish and pain and what I would assume would have been loud sounds of loss because the Jewish people were yet again under the thumb of another empire. This had been their story, right? I mean, this was the perpetual story. There was always an empire that had its boot to the neck of the Jewish people. Their suffering was perpetual, and uh, it was a shock to me to see it in relationship to Advent and realize at the time they were, you know, who writes a Advent book that talks about the Maccabees, but, that was to me a really interesting story to look at the Maccabee revolution or the Maccabee. I mean, it was a bit of a revolution, I suppose. But they were fighting back against, uh, is it Epiphanes? I don't know if I say his name correctly, but, they were pushing against the Seleucid Empire and fighting, again, for some semblance of Jewish independence and freedom from yet another, you know, tyrant, another empire that they were going to have to serve. And, this is where we get the traditions of Hanukkah, right? The Maccabees finally push against this empire and against all odds have a victory. They're this little tiny ragtag group in comparison to this massive enterprise of a military, and they win after, a couple years. And they are able to reclaim their temple and go back in, and what was profaned, they were able to restore and clean up and light the candle again. And this is where there's actually a few different stories, but one of them is that they go in and there's there's a jar of um, oil, and they're able to light it and reclaim that eternal flame of God's presence with them. Um, but of course, it would be short-lived because another empire was already on the horizon making their way. And this is part of the soil, or the predicate to Advent. These are, the nearest ancestors to the characters that we are going to find in the gospel stories of Advent. These are the ancestors of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary, and this is the family that Jesus is going to be born into. People who have suffered generational trauma, and I had never seen it that way before.
That generational trauma thing is definitely real and is there, and it gives you a new perspective. Not only do the people around Zechariah and Elizabeth, Mary, Joseph, but Jesus himself then is a recipient of this generational trauma that is actually then within his body that gets passed down, which is kind of remarkable that the God that we love and serve, that has come for us to be with us, that he chose to be there in
Yes.
that moment with that generational trauma. What does that say to you as you sit with that, as you first started to see that?
I mean, I think it was kind of a rolling revelation as I wrote the book. Because, of course, when you decide that you want to lean into these stories, of course, I had a general idea of what both Luke and Matthew were what they have to say about the birth of Jesus and the entrance of God in a bodily way into our world. But it was this slow rolling revelation of, oh, these are traumatized people. These are the ancestors of Jesus. I know something about what trauma looks like. I think our culture is learning more and more what trauma is and how it presents. And, I had gone 3 years in a row to Palestine. This was all right before COVID hit. And, we are dealing with two traumatized communities, to simplify, right? The Palestinian people and the Jewish people. And they all bear the marks of generational trauma that affects how they perceive one another. how they engage politically. It is what we see, part of what complicates the very thing that we have been witnessing since 10/7 is trauma really changes our brains and the way that we see and understand and react. And to start to weave that together with this Advent story of, oh, this was in the DNA of Jesus, that God chose to enter into a particular place in human history. I was like, wow. Actually, it's quite emblematic of the human experience to come into a world that is filled with economic trouble and exploitation and militarism and violence and abuse. Like, oh, but that is actually probably more the human experience. Like, it actually epitomizes what it is to be human, is the experience of being at the bottom under the boot of an authoritarian or a regime, of being the outsider because of your skin color, your accent, your station in life, your family. Like, oh, he took on what is probably the most universal kind of human experience, something much more akin to what my husband would know being a Burundi, right? Um, Harder for me because I'm one of the privileged people who has grown up in, the Pax Romana or Pax Americana, actually. But, you know, um, I was like, wow, God God chose to enter into the most universal experience of what it is to be human. That includes trauma. And I think that for me was like, "Oh, wow." And if I think about my own social location and where that puts me in the frame and how I have to reorient myself as I read these texts, like where I am versus where this story is happening. And, so as a reader, as a faithful follower of Jesus, that was a challenge. But by the end of the book, I mean, I remember it was actually quite emotional when I realized, "Oh, wait a minute. In the eternal body of God is the experience of trauma and the memory of it." And I remember I was in I was just sitting at my local Starbucks where I do a lot of my work, and, like, just the tears as of the recognition that this is now woven into the incarnation. When we read that thing out of that passage out of Hebrews where it says that we don't have this detached deity, but we have a God who is so deeply like us and who has experienced life as we have. Oh, yeah, we do, because he's experienced empire and trauma, and that is deeply woven into what it is to be, the incarnation of God. But it also gave me this glimmer of hope that the God who has experienced it is the God who won't forget it and who will know in some ultimate way how to heal it. Though it is too slow for my liking. Yeah, but yeah, that was something that I didn't see when I started writing. Over the course of digging deep into these texts, what it did to me personally and my own, talk about meditating, studying and meditating on scripture, so
What a significant experience to walk through that and to help illuminate our eyes and our minds to see that as well as so helpful and heartbreaking as well. And knowing that this family, so even Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary, and this family that Jesus, John the Baptist is coming through, the angels are encountering them. They're a family that has experienced this trauma, but they're also a family and a people that wants liberation,
Mhm.
and they're looking for liberation. um, what did you learn and find out digging into the stories of the encounters of the angels and with especially with Zechariah
Yeah.
and how the women were also elevated, where they were able to actually share and speak and say they have a voice as well, and it's not just the men.
I was most nervous about writing about Zechariah because in all my years, that had been the part of the story that was least interesting to me. Right? We all have our favorite songs on an album. We all have our favorite narratives within the Gospels, the ones that we can imagine or we slip ourselves into that particular scene. But Zechariah wasn't one that I had a deep connection to. And yet, I wanted to give him his day. I wanted to see if I could understand. And I was reading a book written by Richard Horsley, who phenomenal scholar and somebody that I've returned to time and time again. But there was one particular sentence where he talked about Zechariah being, just this ordinary priest. And then he went on to kind of talk about the structure, because I had always thought they were priests, like they were a monolith. I mean, which talks about my own ignorance more than anything, but it hadn't quite occurred to me that, of course, there was a hierarchy. It wasn't just like the high priest and everybody else. It was, there was the high priest and then this group and then that group. And then way down at the bottom, there are these ordinary priests who worked in the villages, and that they almost were by what I would call bivocational. And that was part of what he went on to describe in his scholarship, was that because of Herod kind of coming in and upending, he loved to stir things up, and he stirred things up with the temple apparatus and the priests, and putting his favorites in charge and messing with the actual kind of who should come next, that kind of thing. That all got upended, which meant there was more confusion in terms of who was who and who was next in line in the priesthood in general. But it also meant that, it was just somebody like Zechariah, who was not a big fish. It would have been more precarious for him. Where do I stand? What do I do? Combine that with, really economically fraught times, because Rome didn't only bring a military, they brought a very different way of engaging economically. So all this upheaval, he was this ordinary priest. That job was a little bit tenuous. And then he was living in this very disturbed economic time, trying to survive. And of course, as somebody who didn't have a son, didn't have, any children, again, we get this picture of this person who was like, he wasn't the priest that I always thought of in terms of secure and well tenured within his community, in like stable, and he was actually just somebody who was trying, like, I often think of pastors for smaller congregations in the Midwest who are bivocational. Pastor on the weekend, I visit people, I lead service on the weekend, but I also work, selling cars, or selling tires midweek, or I'm also a teacher or a coach at the local football team, high school, to make ends meet. And that actually is more who Zechariah was. He was struggling. He was this hinge person. He kind of stood between the apparatus, because he still had to go to Jerusalem, still had to serve in that structure, still had a pastoral role in his community, but he also had to work the fields, most likely, or present in helping harvest grapes, or put them through the press and fill the jugs. And so he had this very interesting mix of, I get the hierarchy, I hear enough, but I also know day to day what my neighbors are going through, because it's also my story. And that helped me see him with a clarity and a compassion that I had never, ever had for him before. So I think that was really helpful for me. um, but then, of course, his wife, Elizabeth, who, of course, being a barren woman, just added that patriarchal lens of, I'm a woman in this culture and a barren woman in this culture, and an old barren woman. I mean, just keep pressing it down, this poor woman. And yet her story. It's one of the great reversals, I think, in the Advent narrative, because you see this woman who you expect nothing from. The way that Luke writes her, you expect nothing from her. Society would have expected nothing from her. They wouldn't have looked to her for life. They wouldn't have looked to her as a harbinger of hope. I mean, nobody would have been looking for her. And, then she, has this amazing thing happen where she gets pregnant against all odds, and call it miraculous. I mean, I think that's what we're meant to see, is that this was a miracle happening within her. So already we have this reversal, that there's life where we thought there was none, no possibility, and now she's pregnant. But then her cousin comes in from Nazareth, and these two women have these amazing things happening in their bodies, right? Because now Mary has also been overshadowed by the Spirit and has something quite possibly miraculous or interesting happening within her as well, depending on how you read the story. But here are these two women, and they are the first people to, I think, have these, incarnation conversations. When we know the story, Zechariah gets, he's mute. He's put on mute by the Holy Spirit. He comes back home and has to, has a front row seat to what is happening with his wife and her cousin. Can't say a word, which I think is so fascinating when we think about the role of patriarchy, that I'm going to save you from mansplaining. I'm just going to put you on mute, and you just get to be a witness. But what he witnesses at the dinner table as the women are bringing the food and they're sitting and they are talking, they are doing theology. They are doing the first innovative work of incarnational theology, as they are talking about what's happening in them, and the songs of old and little shards of scripture that they have heard or talked about in their communities, and starting to stitch together and trying to imagine what this might mean. And all the good priest can do is watch and witness to what the Spirit is doing among these women in his life. I mean, I think there again, talk about this reversal. It's so different from the temple apparatus. It's so different from how patriarchy works. It's so different from the empire and the announcements come from on high. It is the reversals, the good seed thrown into soil for a different kind of world.
The liberation that these people were looking for has come through force and violence and trying to overthrow. And Jesus comes in this place, is incarnate with us, and shows us a totally different way where freedom, liberation can come in a place that is nonviolent. And there can be a new type of peacemaking that is not the Pax Romana, and that is something totally different. And I think even the call of Mary as blessed among women, as a reversal from what Jael and Judith were called because of violence, then helps us start this reversal. What is then the role of peacemaking in the incarnation, even starting with Mary and Elizabeth?
I mean, you would think that this would be easy to talk about, but it's I think if you can talk about peacemaking in a way that is really easy and straightforward, you probably haven't really had to try and do. Anybody who talks real clearly about it has probably not lived here for any length of time. Which, talking to my friends on the ground in both Israel and in the West Bank, and which is, Palestine. And while I was matter of fact, one of my good friends who lives there read every chapter she read and would critique. I mean, it was part of the journey of like, oh, I think I can say this thing. And then there's this pushback. Well, it's not always that easy. It's not always that. because then you have to factor in the trauma and you have to, so, I mean, conversations about peacemaking are among the most complex. Um, I mean, I think one thing is that often peacemakers are not who we assume they're gonna be. I mean, as we just talked about in the story of, like, Elizabeth not being who anybody would have assumed had a role in, rolling out God's peace agenda, nor Mary, this young, girl from the troubled part of, Galilee was actually known as being a really troubled territory, with lots of activity, protests and marches and, lots of pushback from the empire and, like, kind of the bad side of town, the troubled part. And here's this young girl who grew up in that, and, nobody would have thought that she was gonna be a facilitator or a participant in God's peace agenda. I mean, one of the things is, like, where you least expect there to be some peacemakers, maybe you ought to spend more time there because they probably are there and you just don't have the eyes to see them. Um, because that's definitely how I felt when I was working with these narratives is, wow, where we look for agents of change or peacemakers, we look to the UN, we look to, the bishops or the higher ups in our churches and NGOs that promote peace. And I'm not saying that there isn't good stuff happening there, but really, we're missing the people who are just on the ground who end up having to live into the hardship and therefore they're the first to kind of innovate any new way, breakthrough of pushback against the empire, of imagining something different, because imagining something different is actually part of what it is to survive fire. Which is part of, again, coming back to your initial question, my husband grew up in a country that had been colonized. Still lives with, although they are technically in an independent country now, they still live with deep, deep grooves from those generations of being colonized, and sometimes he'll handle a situation, and I'm like, "You learned that from colonization. You learned how to manipulate that situation." Yeah, because that's how my dad survived. He figured out, how to subvert this thing and, you know I watched the text and I was like, "Oh, yeah." Some subversive moves, which was part genius and, like, theological, imagination, but a huge part also, we ought to survive this, and this is what it looks like, and so there again, peace, a peace agenda isn't always this great proclamation. It isn't the Oslo Accords where you see people coming together and shaking hands at the podium. It's more gritty and, twisted, and sometimes you wonder, "Is this the way it's gonna happen?" But the people who are really making a difference, and Isaac will be able to speak to this in much more detail, are the people whose names we may never know, and we wouldn't know the names of Zachariah or Mary or Joseph had it not been for, a community that kept their stories alive and made sure that we did. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known who they Caesar certainly didn't know who they were, you know?
I mean, one of the things of ushering peacemaking, I think one of the ways you talk a little bit about hospitality, and hospitality is so important in that region. I mean, my wife and I lived in Jordan for many years, so we know the region. Hospitality is like the highest value that they have. It's very much hospitable. So there is almost there's a near zero chance that
Mhm.
Jesus was born in this barn all by himself, um, with Mary there and all the animals. Like there's a very small, like almost zero chance. So uh, give us a picture of what do you think extended family hospitality would look like, and I think give us a reimagining so that I can go out and create a new nativity scene and make some money off of it that looks different. My wife has been wanting a new nativity scene with the front room and not the barn for many years,
Oh
and so we
my.
might have to make it.
Yeah. Well, so many of our nativity scenes are actually product of the harmonization of these 2 narratives. Because, of course, Matthew's story, very different from Jesus' story, and, the idea that the Magi and there's just a way in which we see them in the Christmas creche that they are not in the actual Gospels. But I guess that's our way of trying to embrace, both of these stories. I agree with you, although I would actually say there is just no chance. There is no chance that Joseph and his pregnant bride made their way down from Nazareth, and nobody would have welcomed them. Matter of fact, one of my friends who I write about, Chef Fadi, who is a modern-day innkeeper in Bethlehem, we stayed at his inn when we would be there, and, I remember talking to him and asking him, what is it like to hear this story?" And he's like, "You know us. We're there's no way we would have let a woman in duress, getting ready to give birth. There's no way we wouldn't have made room for her. That's just who we are as a people." And he says it's so offensive that everybody comes, to Bethlehem, and he's on Star Street, so he's on the route where they process from Jerusalem every year, and he's like, it's just so offensive to me that people would think we would not hardly have been the people that would have, we of all people would have welcomed her and made sure that she would have had a child. But the way that I best understand it is that they make this pretty arduous journey down from Nazareth to Galilee, down from Nazareth down to Bethlehem, and Joseph would have had family. He would, and even if he hadn't grown up there, because there's a good chance he grew up in the north, but he would have had family that would have welcomed him, aunts, uncles, and I think of Burundi again because the joke is every time I go to Burundi, I discover a new branch of our family tree, full of cousins, aunties, that 20 some years, and still I'm hearing about new people that are, from up country that are connected to this huge family system. And I imagine that for Joseph, it would have been the same. There would have been a bevy of family members, and he would have been greeted. Now, there may have been stories about who his bride was. There may have been stories about how quickly they got married and her circumstances. But there's no sense that they wouldn't have been received by a family member into a home. And as I imagine it, here's this a normal night. They're all together. The women are in the kitchen. They're making that classic Arabic or Palestinian salad with cutting the cucumbers and the tomatoes, and and the men are doing whatever they're doing, talking, and I don't know, maybe a little bit of hookah. Who knows? They're all. And her water breaks. And all of a sudden, all these women who have vegetables and meat and whatnot in their hands for dinner wash up as quick as they can. And all of the kitchen staff immediately become midwives. Let's get her to a place. Okay, we can take her out there. The hay is fresh. Let's go out there. And they are around her when she gives birth. There is no sense, after all the research I did about the archaeology and the history and what both you and I know of these pictures, she was not alone in a stable with Joseph. She was surrounded by women. And my heart really hopes that Elizabeth was there, knowing the time was coming that her little cousin would eventually have that baby, and having had those intimate moments. Ein Kerem is not that far from Bethlehem. She would have come and been among, this was, her extended family too, would have been among the family and would have been there holding her hand. And that here is this beautiful picture of her with her elder cousin, who means so much to her, having this child, and the joy when this child was born. Jesus wasn't born into a quiet space. He was born to a space that was loud with love and family. And Yeah. That's how I see it. So I just think you have to get a bigger creche. You have to get a lot more women in there. Find an Elizabeth holding your hand. 'Cause that's how I see it.
That's a beautiful picture. It really is a beautiful picture to be brought in to a place of love, especially for a woman. They didn't know who she was, that she's pregnant out of wedlock. She's there. Like that's a that is a subversive hospitality,
Mhm.
if there ever was one, right there. And it's a beautiful picture. So Jesus ushers in hope. Angels come to the shepherds, saying, bring good news and glad tidings of joy for all people, like Jesus is for all people. There's this great hope. Um, and then you see the life of Jesus. You have this death, this resurrection that just brings now the Spirit of God can live with us and be with us. But we don't have this full consummation yet.
Mm.
We're living in so-called second advent right now, where we're at, which is a place of longing
Yep.
for justice and longing for liberation and freedom. It's longing for the peace between peoples when is war and subjugation of all sorts of people around the world. How do we live in this tension of this second advent that we're living in? And how does that inform the way that we can enter into this advent season that brings us into our present moment and not just reflect on all sorts of other things that happen within Christmas, especially in the West of consumerism and all
Right.
this other stuff. But what does it look like to enter into this moment in our second advent?
Well, this is where, for me, Advent goes a little dark. It A little bit of the genesis story for me of even this project was, I had over the years started developing what I called my Advent ache. I would, start getting close, to Advent, early October-ish, and start to feel, this deep discomfort, um, and a keen awareness of whatever was happening around me. And different seasons, it was different things. It was kids in cages, and those images of families being torn apart, and the sound of children wailing for their mothers, but being separated from them. Um, right, different seasons, there were different images that was like, "Oh, we're here again." That deep awareness that things were not right, were not just, were not good. Um, and we're going into another Advent when everybody is bringing out the lights, and Starbucks is debuting their holiday flavors, and everybody's getting their red cups, and everybody's getting happy. And I always felt like the dissonance between where everybody else was moving up into joy and brightness and happiness, and I started to descend into this deep ache for the world. And, so I was like, "I gotta read these Christmas narratives. What am I missing? I wanna reclaim that hope and that brightness." Just in my own faith, in my own, journey with Jesus and these stories. And in doing so, what I actually found was all the pain that was the predicate to Advent, and that actually I was out of sync with American Christianity. I was actually deeply in sync with the biblical, what Scripture gives us, which is the deep pain and the awareness of it, which we, call lament. And so actually going into Advent, I would sometimes read, the Book of Lamentations, which Walter Brueggemann calls the grief work of the Old Testament. 5 poems of deep, deep grief at a world turned upside down with no hope, nobody even witnessing or paying attention. We have this woman crying out, like, right, "Pay attention to me, but there's none to comfort." And I felt like I became the person who's like, "I will pay attention to you. I will pay attention to the places that hurt." And so for me, Advent has actually been a spot where I reckon with the darkness. And I don't ignore it. I don't try and push or rush past it. I think what these stories do is they invite us to sit with all the loss and the injustice and the pain, and give it its due. Frederick Buechner would say that this is obeying the sadness of our times. And so that has become kind of what I do during Advent is I want to obey the sadness of our times. And even the stories that we have been gifted, we see economic, challenges. We see the pain that comes from patriarchy. We see the pain that comes from being under the boot of these empires. We see Jesus and the stigma that he and his family would grow. Like it's like even in the stories, they're heavy with lament and sadness. I mean, even when Jesus returns home, after they become political refugees in Egypt, even if Joseph is able to bring them home because Herod has died, they'll go home to Bethlehem, where they have all that beautiful family, because there's a massacre there in his name, looking for him. Can't even go back there. They end up going back up to Nazareth, where Mary's family's from, almost like they're internally displaced. So, yes, they get to return. Yes, there's a hope. But boy, is it complex. Boy, is still laden with a degree of sadness. And so for me, Advent has become that space where I don't rush to what is bright and shiny, and I allow myself to really reckon with and to hold the sadness, which doesn't make me the best Christmas guest.
But that's all right. There's so much sadness in the world to be able to hold, and this is what an incarnate God actually gets to do. As Jesus holds our sadness,
Yes.
he holds all of our trauma and our pain. This is a man who was naked on a cross and abused, and he could step into even that type of abuse.
Mhm.
He's like, yes, I have been there, and I was exposed, fully exposed. And so I know that pain that you're
Yeah.
going through, and he's holding it, and we can enter into it with Jesus as
Yes.
holding the pain and knowing that there is a new heaven and new earth coming, that there is a
Mhm.
place where Jesus is restoring it and redeeming all things and making all things new. But we have to enter into this pain. So this year in 2024, as you go into Advent, what are some of the sadness that you are holding? Um, and and
Mhm.
give me maybe an update, something of in Israel, Palestine right now, your friends that you journeyed with this book. How do we enter into their sadness and their pain as well?
Mhm. Well, I am so glad you're gonna be talking to Manther Isak because he offered the most prophetic sermon I've ever heard on Eve in Bethlehem. Um, I remember my husband and I were here listening to it in Arizona, and we listened to it 3 times in a row because we gotta hear it again. We have to hear it again. The most prophetic, honest, voice naming, Jesus under the rubble. That Jesus would have been under the rubble the way the children of Gaza were under the rubble, with all the bombing that was happening in the wake of 10/7. So he'll voice that in a way that I never fully could, and I'm glad you're going to be in conversation with him. But I write about my friend Tahani, who lives in the West Bank, and uh, how great it was to be with her. She had been here in Arizona with me for many years, and that's where we met, and our friendship developed, and our kids got to grow up together for a season. Um, and then she and her family wanted to go back home, and they were dual citizens to whatever degree that exists. They were able to go back to Palestine, to this little village. And, the dream had always been that I would would join her there, but I don't think she really thought I was gonna make it. It took a few years. It took me a few attempts to be able to get to her, but finally I was able to come. And I remember her saying, "Oh, I wish you could come a week earlier because we're right in the middle of harvesting olives and we can't slow down. We had the window of time where we can get them and then process them." No, 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 I will come. I will put on my shoes or what. You tell me what to do. And so I remember spending it was like a 10-hour day, morning till late, till you could barely see the olives on the trees. But we were out there harvesting with her family, and it was probably the most glorious day of my life. Certainly one that I will never forget. Being able to harvest with her and her family, and um, so I've been in her home that her and her husband have made, and over the years have put together. He makes some money over here and then he brings it home, and, they furnish their home and they brought things with care from, the States to put in their home. And, um, in the way things were already hard in Palestine before 7, and that was very underreported in the West. They were already experiencing a lot of, um harassment from the nearby settlements. And of course, 10/7 made everything worse. And so every set of days when she and I would talk, we would use a social media app that we would have a private side conversation. And the harassment coming from her neighbor, you know, um, putting up barbed wire so that they couldn't leave the village without showing their IDs. This was not the government. This was not they're the settlers, and then it's like the people in the guarded gate community down the street, that kind of thing. Um, with their guns saying, "You don't get to leave until we see who's in the car, and we take names." And she has now 2 older sons, 16 and 18, so they're men, young Palestinian men, and, talking about, they come into our village at night now, and they will blow up cars at random. Or they'll come in and they will try and steal our sheep. Or like different time like every few there were different things that these settlers were trying to do to harass them and push them out. And my friend does not like baking, but she's like, "Kelley, I'm baking bread every day because it's too dangerous to send my sons or my husband out to go get bread. So I am the very thing I don't like to do, I am doing it every day because a safety measure." Well, we were doing sourdough starters during COVID, for the heck of it. She was making daily bread because it kept the men in her life safe. So, just last week, yeah, and of course, you can imagine the despair. Like, if we leave, we'll never be able to come back. They'll take over our house. Everything we've built, this is my inheritance from my family. It'll be gone. And do that, or do we try and hold out hope? Am I wrong? I mean, and she has told me to share her story because she wants people to know. I just want my kids to live a good life. I want them to inherit this house that we've built. I don't want them to be harassed. I don't want to cause anybody any trouble. But she's really wrestled with it. And lately, they've been doing sound bombs, which people know there's a such thing. But the whole point is to terrorize because you know, it's just these incredibly large sounds, and, this has been happening nightly in her driveway, you know, to terrorize her family. So, finally, they decided, the husband and the older sons, to leave. And, of course, it was treacherous to get out, um, but they made it out, and because they all do have US passports, they were able to land here in the States, on election day, actually. And it was this little bright spot that those 3 for now are safe. They're coming into a space where we had just that very day elected an autocrat who doesn't like brown-skinned people very much. Even as I was relieved that they were safe, I also know that it's a tenuous kind of safety, and the trauma that traveled with them in their own body, the sounds of those sounds, the sight of the older son had been chased down several times while he was tending the sheep. Like, those things don't just leave your body because you land in US soil, contrary to what my sweet mother would think. I was like, "No, they bring that trauma with them." So I mean, that's where I'm at. I've journeyed deeply with one friend that I could be present to. Every week talking, every set of days checking in, caring for her family. That is because I can't the larger picture, Biden has broken my heart in more ways than I will ever be able to articulate without profanity. Um, I know our US policy, it's not just him, he's part of a political apparatus. Like, I can't even do that. But I have chosen to journey with one friend. And, she says, "Whenever you can, tell my story, that people know I just wanna live?" He still is there with 2 young children, and hopes that, she'll be able to join, but, yeah, it's hard. This is the terrain of Advent, this is the terrain of both the first Advent and again, the Advent that we still live in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So what what do you hope, uh, there's that word hope. Give us how we should enter into Advent this year. What is your hope for people as they enter into Advent? What should we be holding onto?
I would just encourage people to have eyes to see. Uh, Jesus often said, "Do you have eyes, but do they see? You have ears, but do you have the capacity to hear? Do we see and do we hear the pain of those around us, our actual neighbors? Um, and can we be those that accompany them, to sit with them in that place, and not force them to mask and have to pretend that they don't. I mean, I think that's a lot of what we demand from some of our friends, that when they're with us, they kind of pretend that it's not that bad. We're okay. But of course, if we really have eyes to see and ears that hear, we should be open to, some of those places of pain that our friends and our neighbors suffer, and how can we make space and be the kind of people that they can let their mask down and just have those honest conversations with us the way Tahani and I have had this last year about how hard how hard it is. And she'll say, "Well, what are you cooking today?" And I was like, "After you told me the reason you're baking bread, the last thing I would do is tell you, like, right, what I am doing." But that is part of the reciprocity, is that she says, "I get hope when I hear what you're doing, because I hope that I'm gonna survive and be with you someday." And we're right? And so there is this sense that how do we create that kind of deep solidarity with one another? And I think a lot of that begins with being able to hold space for one another's pain. And that comes in different ways. You can be a group that's feeling particularly discriminated against. You can be a group of people right now who are particularly afraid of what's going to happen come January 20, when we have regime change, in a sense. You can listen and take people, like, again, we're back to believing people. If your neighbor is telling you, "I really am afraid about that talk of deportation." I live in Arizona, so a lot of my neighbors are and live in mixed status families. The fear is real for a lot of my neighbors. And to believe people when they tell you that they really are afraid, and to allow them, if they feel safe enough, to process that with you, and to figure out, how am I a neighbor? How am I like the Good Samaritan, the one who, you know, actually cares and will get involved, is willing to kinda get involved in whatever way I can to be a presence of love and support and solidarity. But that happens by kinda opening ourselves up to each other, um, because I think that's the way you survive empires. You have to do it together.
No, that's so good. I have a couple quick questions I like to ask at the end. Say, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh, man. I was a pretty good 21-year-old, so I didn't make classic mistakes. I mean, I really don't think there's anything I would tell my 21-year-old self was pretty sharp in that, I have to be honest, is that I kinda knew at a young age, like, I'm gonna be a slow roll. I'm a bit of a crock pot, not a microwave. I always had that sense, like, and I didn't publish my first book till I was 48 years old, right? Like, it takes the amount of time it takes to become who you are and make your contribution, whatever that is. And there's no need to rush it or try and fast track it. And, you know, I guess I learned that in my late 20s. So maybe I would just, get to jump on, yeah, 21-year-old self. It'll take the time it takes. And that is a good thing.
That is really good. Kelley, is there anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I just finished reading The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And man, I highly recommend it. And I read it thinking 2 things. Number 1, like, I have finally found somebody who he articulates exactly what I felt when I was both in and then came out of Palestine. And he has such a phenomenal communicator, but, like, some of the sensations that he named were things that I felt but didn't know how to name, and so I felt deeply seen when I read how he talked about, his longest essay is the essay about his time in Palestine. And I just felt deeply in his company, and that felt I didn't know how much that was going to mean, but it meant a lot to me to feel like, "Okay, I'm not alone. These things I felt were real." And so that was really a gift to me, but also the way his moral clarity in talking about what's happening in Palestine, I found so refreshing because so many people wanna say, "It's so complex over there." Um, and it is, and there also is something about it that is quite straightforward, again, if you have eyes to see. And I think he named that quite well. And so for anybody who is going to, hold Palestine close, this Advent season, that is a really his book is a really great companion.
I think everybody should go out and get the first Advent in Palestine this Advent season. It's one of the best Advent books out there. It's fantastic. It's incredible as you walked through these stories and actually get to show us fresh and give us fresh eyes so that we could see things that we haven't been seeing, especially for us in America and the West, where we live in the empire. And so we get to see with empire eyes, usually. And so to actually then subvert just the culture that we live in and are swimming in is really refreshing and helpful for everybody to see. So well done. I want everybody to go out and get it. But where else would you like to point people to? How can people connect with you?
I am not really good with all the bells and whistles. I am on Instagram. And I'm on Threads. That's about it. I have a website where, kelleynikondeha.com if you just wanna see kind of the body of my work. Um, but, yeah, you can follow me on Instagram, and you'll get a little bit of, sometimes it's, food, sometimes it's, um, serious, intense things that I'm reading. But my friends, as I read intense things. I've never been into, what do you call it? Fiction. I'm much into my, cookbook is my idea of light reading. But you'll get cookbook recommendations and book recommendations and etcetera, so follow me on Insta.
Nice. Awesome. That's beautiful. Well, Kelley, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for helping us enter into Advent and holding the sadness of
Mm,
the world today and the world in which Jesus came into,
mhm.
and pointing out the generational trauma that the people had, the economic place that the economics were not there, that they were actually under the influence of empire for centuries, for a long time. And that Jesus shows us a new way and a better way of peacemaking and peace, which is a nonviolent form of
Yes.
ushering in peace, and that there is hope for this world. That as we follow Jesus, as he shows us, as he has been incarnate in this world, and has actually shown us a way, as somebody who walked this earth to live a certain way, we get to actually enter into a place where we could follow him in that. And we don't have to just know about him or be somebody who says, I'm going to be saved for eternity, but we could actually enter into a place where we pray that the kingdom of heaven comes on earth, and it's there, and we could enter into it as well. And so this Advent season, let's hold the sadness and let's pray for this new hope that's going to come to us, and we're going to see the redemption and reconciliation of all things because Jesus is making all things new. So Kelley, thank you. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.